This is a LibriVox recording. All the LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please contact LibriVox.org. Recorded by Peter Yearsley. Present at a Hanging and Other Ghost Stories by Ambrose Bierce. Soldier Folk. A Man with Two Lives. Here is the queer story of David William Duck, related by himself. Duck is an old man living in Aurora, Illinois, where he is universally respected. He is commonly known, however, as Dead Duck. In the autumn of 1866, I was a private soldier of the 18th Infantry. My company was one of those stationed at Fort Phil Kearny, commanded by Colonel Carrington. The country is more or less familiar with the history of that garrison, particularly with the slaughter by the Sioux of a detachment of 81 men and officers, not one escaping, through disobedience of orders by its commander, the brave but reckless Captain Fetterman. When that occurred, I was trying to make my way with important dispatches to Fort C.F. Smith on the Bighorn. As the country swarmed with hostile Indians, I travelled by night and concealed myself as best I could before daybreak. The better to do so, I went afoot, armed with a Henry rifle and carrying 3 days' rations in my haversack. For my second place of concealment, I chose what seemed in the darkness a narrow canyon leading through a range of rocky hills. It contained many large boulders, detached from the slopes of the hills. Behind one of these, in a clump of sagebrush, I made my bed for the day and soon fell asleep. It seemed as if I had hardly closed my eyes, though in fact it was nearly midday, when I was awakened by the report of a rifle, the bullet striking the boulder just above my body. A band of Indians had trailed me and had me nearly surrounded. The shot had been fired with an execrable aim by a fellow who had caught sight of me from the hillside above. The smoke of his rifle betrayed him, and I was no sooner on my feet than he was off his and rolling down the declivity. Then I ran in a stooping posture, dodging among the clumps of sagebrush, in a storm of bullets from invisible enemies. The rascals did not rise and pursue, which I thought rather queer, for they must have known by my trail that they had to deal with only one man. The reason for their inaction was soon made clear. I had not gone 100 yards before I reached the limit of my run, the head of the gulch which I had mistaken for a canyon. It terminated in a concave breast of rock, nearly vertical and destitute of vegetation. In that cul-de-sac I was caught like a bear in a pen. Pursuit was needless. They had only to wait. They waited. For 2 days and nights, crouched behind a rock topped with a growth of mesquite, and with a cliff at my back, suffering agonies of thirst, and absolutely hopeless of deliverance, I fought the fellows at long range, firing occasionally at the smoke of their rifles, as they did at that of mine. Of course, I did not dare to close my eyes at night, and lack of sleep was a keen torture. I remember the morning of the 3rd day, which I knew was to be my last. I remember rather indistinctly that in my desperation and delirium I sprang out into the open and began firing my repeating rifle without seeing anybody to fire at, and I remember no more of that fight. The next thing that I recollect was my pulling myself out of a river just at nightfall. I had not a rag of clothing and knew nothing of my whereabouts, but all that night I travelled, cold and footsore, towards the north. At daybreak I found myself at Fort C.F. Smith, my destination, but without my dispatches. The first man that I met was a sergeant named William Briscoe, whom I knew very well. You can fancy his astonishment at seeing me in that condition, and my own at his asking who the devil I was. "Dave Duck," I answered. "Who should I be?" He stared like an owl. "You do look it," he said, and I observed that he drew a little away from me. "What's up?" he added. I told him what had happened to me the day before. He heard me through, still staring. Then he said, "My dear fellow, if you are Dave Duck, I ought to inform you that I buried you 2 months ago. I was out with a small scouting party, and found your body, full of bullet holes, and newly scalped, somewhat mutilated otherwise too, I'm sorry to say, right where you say you made your fight. Come to my tent, and I'll show you your clothing, and some letters that I took from your person. The commandant has your dispatches." He performed that promise. He showed me the clothing, which I resolutely put on, the letters, which I put into my pocket. He made no objection, then took me to the commandant, who heard my story, and coldly ordered Briscoe to take me to the guardhouse. On the way I said, "Bill Briscoe, did you really and truly bury the dead body that you found in these togs?" "Sure," he answered, "just as I told you. It was Dave Duck, all right. Most of us knew him." "And now, you damned impostor, you'd better tell me who you are." "I'd give something to know," I said. A week later I escaped from the guardhouse and got out of the country as fast as I could. Twice I've been back seeking for that fateful spot in the hills, but unable to find it. 3 and 1 are 1. In the year 1861, Bar Lassiter, a young man of 22, lived with his parents and an elder sister near Carthage, Tennessee. The family were in somewhat humble circumstances, subsisting by cultivation of a small and not very fertile plantation. Owning no slaves, they were not rated among the best people of their neighborhood, but they were honest persons of good education, fairly well-mannered, and as respectable as any family could be, if uncredentialed by personal dominion over the sons and daughters of Ham. The elder Lassiter had that severity of manner that so frequently affirms an uncompromising devotion to duty and conceals a warm and affectionate disposition. He was of the iron of which martyrs are made, but in the heart of the matrix had lurked a nobler metal, fusible at a milder heat, yet never colouring nor softening the hard exterior. By both heredity and environment, something of the man's inflexible character had touched the other members of the family. The Lassiter home, though not devoid of domestic affection, was a veritable citadel of duty, and duty is as cruel as death. When the war came on, it found in the family, as in many others in that state, a divided sentiment. The young man was loyal to the Union, the others savagely hostile. This unhappy division begot an insupportable domestic bitterness, and when the offending son and brother left home with the avowed purpose of joining the Federal army, not a hand was laid in his, not a word of farewell was spoken, not a good wish followed him out into the world whither he went, to meet with such spirit as he might whatever fate awaited him. Making his way to Nashville, already occupied by the army of General Buell, he enlisted in the first organization that he found, a Kentucky regiment of cavalry, and in due time passed through all the stages of military evolution, from raw recruit to experienced trooper. A right good trooper he was, too, although in his oral narrative from which this tale is made there was no mention of that. The fact was learned from his surviving comrades, for Bar Lassiter has answered, "Here," to the sergeant whose name is Death. 2 years after he had joined it, his regiment passed through the region whence he had come. The country thereabout had suffered severely from the ravages of war, having been occupied alternately and simultaneously by the belligerent forces, and a sanguinary struggle had occurred in the immediate vicinity of the Lassiter homestead. But of this the young trooper was not aware. Finding himself in camp near his home, he felt a natural longing to see his parents and sister, hoping that in them, as in him, the unnatural animosities of the period had been softened by time and separation. Obtaining a leave of absence, he set foot in the late summer afternoon and soon after the rising of the full moon was walking up the gravel path leading to the dwelling in which he had been born. Soldiers in war age rapidly, and in youth 2 years are a long time. Barr Lassiter felt himself an old man, and had almost expected to find the place a ruin and a desolation. Nothing apparently was changed. At the sight of each dear and familiar object he was profoundly affected. His heart beat audibly, his emotion nearly suffocated him, an ache was in his throat. Unconsciously he quickened his pace until he almost ran, his long shadow making grotesque efforts to keep its place beside him. The house was unlighted, the door open. As he approached and paused to recover control of himself, his father came out and stood bareheaded in the moonlight. "Father!" cried the young man, springing forward with outstretched hand. "Father!" The elder man looked him sternly in the face, stood a moment motionless, and without a word withdrew into the house. Bitterly disappointed, humiliated, inexpressibly hurt, and altogether unnerved, the soldier dropped upon a rustic seat, in deep dejection, supporting his head upon his trembling hand. But he would not have it so. He was too good a soldier to accept repulse as defeat. He rose and entered the house, passing directly to the sitting-room. It was dimly lighted by an uncurtained east window. On a low stool by the hearth-side, the only article of furniture in the place, sat his mother, staring into a fireplace strewn with blackened embers and cold ashes. He spoke to her, tenderly, interrogatively, and with hesitation, but she neither answered, nor moved, nor seemed in any way surprised. True, there had been time for her husband to apprise her of their guilty son's return. He moved nearer, and was about to lay his hand upon her arm, when his sister entered from an adjoining room, looked him full in the face, passed him without a sign of recognition, and left the room by a door that was partly behind him. He had turned his head to watch her, but when she was gone, his eyes again sought his mother. She, too, had left the place. Barr Lassiter strode to the door by which he had entered. The moonlight on the lawn was tremulous, as if the sward were a rippling sea. The trees and their black shadows shook as in a breeze. Blended with its borders, the gravel walk seemed unsteady and insecure to step on. This young soldier knew the optical illusions produced by tears. He felt them on his cheek, and saw them sparkle on the breast of his trooper's jacket. He left the house and made his way back to camp. The next day, with no very definite intention, with no dominant feeling that he could rightly have named, he again sought the spot. Within a half-mile of it he met Bushrod Albro, a former playfellow and schoolmate, who greeted him warmly. "I'm going to visit my home," said the soldier. The other looked at him rather sharply, but said nothing. "I know," continued Lassiter, "that my folks have not changed, but—" "There have been changes," Albro interrupted. "Everything changes. I'll go with you if you don't mind. We can talk as we go." But Albro did not talk. Instead of a house, they found only fire-blackened foundations of stone enclosing an area of compact ashes, pitted by rains. Lassiter's astonishment was extreme. "I could not find the right way to tell you," said Albro. "In the fight a year ago, your house was burned by a Federal shell." "And my family? Where are they?" "In heaven, I hope. All were killed by the shell." A Baffled Ambuscade. Connecting Readyville and Woodbury was a good hard turnpike 9 or 10 miles long. Readyville was an outpost of the Federal army at Murfreesboro. Woodbury had the same relation to the Confederate army at Tullahoma. For months after the big battle at Stone River, these outposts were in constant quarrel, most of the trouble occurring, naturally, on the turnpike mentioned, between detachments of cavalry. Sometimes the infantry and artillery took a hand in the game, by way of showing their goodwill. One night a squadron of Federal horse, commanded by Major Seidel, a gallant and skilful officer, moved out from Readyville on an uncommonly hazardous enterprise requiring secrecy, caution, and silence. Passing the infantry pickets, the detachment soon afterward approached two cavalry vedettes staring hard into the darkness ahead. There should have been three. "Where is your other man?" said the major. "I ordered Dunning to be here tonight." "He rode forward, sir," the man replied. "There was a little firing afterward, but it was a long way to the front." "It was against orders and against sense for Dunning to do that," said the officer, obviously vexed. "Why did he ride forward?" "Don't know, sir. He seemed mighty restless. Guess he was scared." When this remarkable reasoner and his companion had been absorbed into the expeditionary force, it resumed its advance. Conversation was forbidden. Arms and accoutrements were denied the right to rattle. The horses' tramping was all that could be heard, and the movement was slow, in order to have as little as possible of that. It was after midnight, and pretty dark, although there was a bit of moon somewhere behind the masses of cloud. 2 or 3 miles along, the head of the column approached a dense forest of cedars, bordering the road on both sides. The major commanded a halt by merely halting, and, evidently himself a bit skeered, rode on alone to reconnoitre. He was followed, however, by his adjutant and 3 troopers, who remained a little distance behind, and, unseen by him, saw all that occurred. After riding about 100 yards towards the forest, the major suddenly and sharply reined in his horse, and sat motionless in the saddle. Near the side of the road, in a little open space, and hardly 10 paces away, stood the figure of a man, dimly visible and as motionless as he. The major's first feeling was that of satisfaction in having left his cavalcade behind. If this were an enemy and should escape, he would have little to report. The expedition was as yet undetected. Some dark object was dimly discernible at the man's feet. The officer could not make it out. With the instinct of the true cavalryman, and a particular indisposition to the discharge of firearms, he drew his sabre. The man on foot made no movement in answer to the challenge. The situation was tense and a bit dramatic. Suddenly the moon burst through a rift in the clouds, and, himself in the shadow of a group of great oaks, the horseman saw the footman clearly in a patch of white light. It was Trooper Dunning, unarmed and bareheaded. The object at his feet resolved itself into a dead horse, and at a right angle across the animal's neck lay a dead man, face upward, in the moonlight. "Dunning has had the fight of his life," thought the major, and was about to ride forward. Dunning raised his hand, motioning him back with a gesture of warning. Then, lowering the arm, he pointed to the place where the road lost itself in the blackness of the cedar forest. The major understood, and turning his horse, rode back to the little group that had followed him and was already moving to the rear in fear of his displeasure, and so returned to the head of his command. "Dunning is just ahead there," he said to the captain of his leading company. "He has killed his man and will have something to report." Right patiently they waited, sabres drawn, but Dunning did not come. In an hour the day broke, and the whole force moved cautiously forward, its commander not altogether satisfied with his faith in Private Dunning. The expedition had failed, but something remained to be done. In the open space off the road they found the fallen horse. At a right angle, across the animal's neck, face upward, a bullet in the brain, lay the body of Trooper Dunning, stiff as a statue, hours dead. Examination disclosed abundant evidence that within a half-hour the cedar forest had been occupied by a strong force of Confederate infantry, an ambuscade. 2 military executions. In the spring of the year 1862, General Buell's big army lay in camp, licking itself into shape for the campaign which resulted in the victory at Shiloh. It was a raw, untrained army, although some of its fractions had seen hard enough service with a good deal of fighting in the mountains of western Virginia and in Kentucky. The war was young, and soldiering a new industry, imperfectly understood by the young American of the period, who found some features of it not altogether to his liking. Chief among these was that essential part of discipline, subordination. To one imbued from infancy with the fascinating fallacy that all men are born equal, unquestioning submission to authority is not easily mastered, and the American volunteer soldier in his green and salad days is among the worst known. That is how it happened that one of Buell's men, Private Bennett Story Green, committed the indiscretion of striking his officer. Later in the war he would not have done that. Like Sir Andrew Aguecheek, he would have seen him damned first. But time for reformation of his military manners was denied him. He was promptly arrested on complaint of the officer, tried by court-martial, and sentenced to be shot. "You might have thrashed me and let it go at that," said the condemned man to the complaining witness. "That is what you used to do at school, when you were plain Will Dudley, and I was as good as you. Nobody saw me strike you. Discipline would not have suffered much." "Ben Green, I guess you are right about that," said the lieutenant. "Will you forgive me? That is what I came to see you about." There was no reply, and an officer, putting his head in at the door of the guard tent where the conversation had occurred, explained that the time allowed for the interview had expired. The next morning, when, in the presence of the whole brigade, Private Green was shot to death by a squad of his comrades, Lieutenant Dudley turned his back upon the sorry performance and muttered a prayer for mercy, in which himself was included. A few weeks afterwards, as Buell's leading division was being ferried over the Tennessee River to assist in succouring Grant's beaten army, night was coming on, black and stormy. Through the wreck of battle the division moved inch by inch in the direction of the enemy, who had withdrawn a little to reform his lines. But for the lightning the darkness was absolute. Never for a moment did it cease, and ever when the thunder did not crack and roar were heard the moans of the wounded, among whom the men felt their way with their feet, and upon whom they stumbled in the gloom. The dead were there too. There were dead a-plenty. In the first faint grey of the morning, when the swarming advance had paused to resume something of definition as a line of battle, and skirmishers had been thrown forward, word was passed along to call the roll. The first sergeant of Lieutenant Dudley's company stepped to the front, and began to name the men in alphabetical order. He had no written roll, but a good memory. The men answered to their names as he ran down the alphabet to G. "Gorham, here. Grayrock, here." The sergeant's good memory was affected by habit. "Green, here." The response was clear, distinct, unmistakable. A sudden movement, an agitation of the entire company front, as from an electric shock, attested the startling character of the incident. The sergeant paled and paused. The captain strode quickly to his side and said sharply, "Call that name again." Apparently the Society for Psychical Research is not first in the field of curiosity concerning the unknown. "Bennett Green, here." All faces turned in the direction of the familiar voice. The two men, between whom in the order of stature Green had commonly stood in line, turned and squarely confronted each other. "Once more," commanded the inexorable investigator, and once more came, a trifle tremulously, the name of the dead man. "Bennett Story Green, here." At that instant a single rifle shot was heard, away to the front, beyond the skirmish line, followed, almost attended, by the savage hiss of an approaching bullet which, passing through the line, struck audibly, punctuating, as with a full stop, the captain's exclamation, What the devil does it mean?" Lieutenant Dudley pushed through the ranks from his place in the rear. "It means this," he said, throwing open his coat and displaying a visibly broadening stain of crimson on his breast. His knees gave way, he fell awkwardly, and lay dead. A little later the regiment was ordered out of line to relieve the congested front, and through some misplay in the game of battle was not again under fire. Nor did Bennett Green, expert in military executions, ever again signify his presence at one. End of Present at a Hanging. Soldier Folk.